Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Larry Kasper. Our guests are Anthony Hennen from the Center Square, Bruce Siwy from USA Today Network, and Kate Huangpu from Spotlight PA. Kate, we'll start with you. When Governor Shapiro gave his second annual budget speech the other day, which priorities stood out to you?
The biggest priority was definitely basic education funding. That was something that everyone had their eye on, given the Commonwealth Court's recent ruling, and he recommended a major increase. Last year, it was about $1 billion. This year, he nearly doubled that, with most of it going to the basic education fund, but also auxiliary programs like mental health, improving school environment, free menstrual products. So that was a major decision on his part.
Kate, refresh us on that court ruling you mentioned a minute ago, please.
Essentially, Commonwealth Court ruled that the current funding formula for public schools K through 12 in the state was declared constitutionally inequitable. So the way that schools were getting funding was not fair. This resulted in like a month-long commission process by the state legislature, where they went around the state listening to what problems existed within the formula. And the findings, while generally concluded that they needed to find a way to stabilize funding for poor schools, Republicans and Democrats disagreed on how much should be allocated towards that. So Democrats decided it was about $5.4 billion, whereas Republicans refused to put a price tag on how much it would cost.
Anthony, what does the basic education budget look like for kindergarten through 12?
Yeah, so I think underlying a lot of this is simply, the way that education is funded in Pennsylvania. It's very dependent on local funding. And so we see this constant issue with property taxes, whether they're too high or they're not getting taxed at the proper rate. So I think that's really the root issue of why this gets pushed out to the state government to figure out and try to fill this gap. I think that's kind of the underlying tension here between Republicans and Democrats, where we've seen some significant increases in state funding in recent years. Even nationally, Pennsylvania is kind of in the top tier of how much per student funding actually is. But it's really figuring out a way, or at least a political compromise, on how to move this money around. And even when we see these proposals, as much as we need to jigger this and change it up, there's heavy reluctance to actually say, these schools will get less next year than they did this year. Mm-hmm. So I think, even as both sides recognize something needs to change, there's some very heavy structural problems here to actually get a fix and get a compromise and find something that can get actually through both chambers of the legislature here.
So have the school districts of Pennsylvania been assured they won't get less than they did last time?
Yes, I believe Shapiro reiterated that in his budget address.
Mm-hmm. And when the court ruling came out, let's just talk about that a little bit more, because it's intriguing, because the court really didn't give any kind of remedy or detail. When they said that Pennsylvania had done an unconstitutional job of funding education, they seemed to stop there. And then I suppose the implication was for lawmakers to act. And have they answered this call in addition to the governor's proposal the other day?
Yeah, I think, things are still getting worked through. Again, the Democratic response has been, this is clear, we need to get more funding out. Mm-hmm. Whereas Republicans are arguing, maybe we need to expand school choice. Maybe we need to pay more attention to school reserve funds and requiring them to spend that out. I think it's going to get very interesting. I think this is also very clearly why the court ruling did not want to lay out a plan. Mm-hmm. Keep their hands out of it, let the legislature fight it out, let the governor figure out a way to enact a compromise. But I think going forward here, given last year's budget debate over trying to fund lifeline scholarships and expand school choice, and Republicans really felt betrayed by that, I think any future compromise here, it's going to be tricky. Republicans are going to be much more skeptical this time around than they were last time, and that could really propose some high hurdles we got to jump.
Bruce, let's get you involved. What jumped out at you when you heard the governor's budget proposal the other day?
I think basic education and the amount of money that he's looking to invest there certainly stood out. That was pretty ambitious. And also higher education was something he addressed as well. And I think that there were some eye-raising things about that. He talked about how Pennsylvania is investing, in terms of investment, Pennsylvania is 49th in the nation in terms of higher education. What he's sort of proposing here are some increases over 5 years that would bring Pennsylvania from 49th to 22nd, which is quite a jump. So he's looking at, for the community college and state system, he's looking at an increase of about, I believe it's 15%. And then for the universities such as Pitt, Penn State, Temple, and Lincoln, a 5% increase. He's also looking at, from a family and student perspective, how to sort of get wrangle in expenses. He talked about tuition caps for families making under the median income, putting that at about $1,000 per semester. And that would obviously require a significant investment in able to do that. I believe he talked about $279 million to make that happen.
Well, Bruce, let's talk about that for a minute. That's certainly one of the more interesting aspects of the education proposal by Governor Shapiro, and I'll give a little bit more detail. Now, this has to do with limiting the tuition at state system schools, and I understand there would be an income limit of $70,000 a year for the family, and like you said, that would make the tuition at a maximum $1,000. So Anthony and Kate, is this the kind of plan that legislators might latch onto?
I think there's mixed feelings right now in the state legislature, especially amongst Senate Republicans, which I think is the biggest hurdle for Governor Shapiro. I think there's been a lot of applause on the part of lawmakers for the amount of investment or the acknowledgement that PASHE and community college higher education as a whole needs to be restructured. I think notably, Shapiro does try to sidestep something that's been a repeated political debacle of the past few years, which is funding state-related universities. That's something that's become increasingly difficult because there's this higher 2/3 requirement in the state legislature, and that's been the House Republicans have been less willing to vote for it.
And Shapiro wants to change that to a simple majority, Kate. That's important, right? Instead of 2/3.
Right.
And then he says
exactly.
that'll expedite approving funding for schools.
Right, exactly.
That is to say the state-related or the state-owned schools.
The state-owned schools, as well as PASHE Community College, it would all be in one big funding formula that would not require legislative approval anymore. But yeah, Shapiro has left a lot of how this will look specifically up to the state legislature. He's done that a few times in his budget proposal, like the basic education fund as well. I believe $830 billion or so, the vast majority is going into an adequacy formula that hasn't been specified either.
What do you think, Anthony? Can legislators, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit technically, but I can see how important it would ultimately be to approving funding if the majority is changed from 2/3 to 1/2. And again, Governor Shapiro thinks that will speed up funding. And again, I pose the question, are legislators going to latch on to that?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps sidestep some roadblocks. So on that level, I think it could expedite things. But I think, again, Pennsylvania is a state where the college-age population is dramatically declining. We're seeing a lot of competition for students between the PASHE system and the state-related, and that's been a long-term sticking point. But I think at the same time, PASHE has at least shown a strong willingness to embrace reforms. I mean, we've seen mergers, we've seen them trying to hold tuition and costs steady over the past 6 years now. So they've made some strides. I think it's just these structural issues that are especially prevalent in Pennsylvania, but we're seeing across a lot of states. I think Shapiro's idea to combine PASHE and community colleges, I think that's at least something we could see Republicans being receptive toward. The issue of actually getting even more funding into these schools, I think that, again, can be a stumbling block. As we see, when we're looking long term, Pennsylvania is facing a budget deficit structurally that's going to have to be filled somehow. We have an aging population. And generally, when we see these political choices between funding services for, healthcare for senior citizens versus boosting higher education, generally higher ed's going to lose out on this. So I think there's some wiggle room here, but there's still a long road ahead. I think, again, Shapiro proposing this without a bunch of details is going to be, it could sink or swim. Republicans have shown a lot of willingness to work on these issues, but they're coming at this from, we're not writing a blank check anymore. We need to come in and be a partner, as State Rep Jesse Topper has said before. So depending on how welcome Republicans are and their demands to be a partner in this is. I think that's really what's going to hinge on higher ed getting more funding, how well this restructuring will actually go.
And a little bit more about the merger, everyone. How are community colleges receiving this proposal from the governor to merge the state system schools with community colleges? And obviously he perceives benefits there. And what's on the record so far as reaction from really either of these institutions, the community colleges and the state-owned schools?
Yeah, I think immediately after the budget got rolled out, the governor's office quickly sent out a media release, arguing, here's what everyone is saying about how great this plan is, and he made very sure that higher ed leaders were prominently on that list. So it seems, if nothing else, he has buy-in from some of the top officials. Whether everyone will fall in line on this and really agree with it remains to be seen.
So let's talk some more about the problem that makes this discussion necessary, and that is the enrollment going down at the state's 14 state-owned schools. And briefly, why is that happening? Just more options for students? What's going on?
Yeah, I think broadly, the argument that's being made is there aren't enough incentives for students to stay in Pennsylvania or to go to Pennsylvania in the first place because of rising tuition levels. But I think there's a wider sort of argument that budget's trying to make in terms of incentivizing young people to stay in the state, giving them tax credits for, for workforce areas that are underpopulated. So like nursing, education, things like that. Shapiro talked a lot in his address about trying to make Pennsylvania a more competitive economically viable state. He released an entire plan about it like the week before the budget address with the Department of Community and Economic Development. And that really emphasized, sort of growing the industries in Pennsylvania that are currently sort of dwindling.
Kate, let's talk about a story you wrote about. It has to do with so-called skill games. And before we go any farther, can you please define a skill game for us as far as this discussion is concerned, as far as the legislature and the governor are concerned?
Yes. So this kind of skill game, it's a game of gambling, but it's not purely chance. So there is a degree of dexterity or skill that's required. This was sort of decided by the Commonwealth Court.
So there's agreement that there is actually skill involved in a skill game now. I'm always concerned with nomenclature.
Yes, exactly. That was the big argument where whether or not these games should be allowed in the first place, because if they're completely chance, then technically they under state law, they wouldn't be allowed. But Commonwealth Court has decided that there is skill involved and therefore they are permissible, but currently they're not covered under state law. So they're not regulated at all. They're not taxed at all. And that's been a subject of debate over the past few years in the state legislature as to, how we could recoup money essentially from this.
Right. And what's the debate sound like, Kate, pro and con on the so-called skill games?
The pro is that there's money to be made here. Historically, Pennsylvania has taxed a lot of gambling.
How many of those machines are out there, Kate? Do you know?
I believe it's something in the hundreds.
Hundreds statewide?
Yeah, statewide.
Anyway, the governor thinks there's potential for revenue there.
Exactly. I think he's proposing taxing them around 42%, which is quite high, but compared to other gambling games, I believe we tax tables at casinos like 54% or something to that effect. I believe the con is just more about how regulated this should be. Again, gambling has a tendency to cause addiction. It's not necessarily, it's a part of like one of the sin taxes. So taxing things that aren't necessarily great for the public. That's the primary debate in the state legislature. But I believe that overall there is an agreement that it should be regulated in some form or another. And therefore the state should recoup money in some form or another.
So we'll see how that works out. Bruce, let's turn back to you and consider what's in the budget concerning mental health services.
So last year, there was an increase in mental health services that went to counties in terms of funding. The counties did receive about $20 million in extra funding. They were calling for a significant increase on top of what they received last year as well. upwards, I believe, of $200 million. This year's budget being proposed by Governor Shapiro shows an additional $20 million, which of course is moving in the right direction. But the County Commissioners Association is sort of calling this more of a Band-Aid. They say more help is needed to fund critical services and intervention to keep people out of the hospital and out of jail. And it's really something that they expressed some disappointments about, and maybe one of the few areas that didn't see as much of a dramatic increase in terms of spending when you're looking at a budget that it does go, I believe, approximately $3 billion over last year's proposal. And on the county end, again, they've expressed a little bit of disappointment that they didn't receive quite as much as they were hoping for this time around in terms of increases. Although last year, it is worth noting, was the first time in several years that they had received any increase at all.
Let's talk some more about the governor's proposal to legalize recreational marijuana. And he was very plain about that. He said, put a bill on my desk that legalizes recreational marijuana. And as far as the reasoning is concerned and any possible social consequences are concerned, what's his reasoning? Who can tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think, this is something that I think there's two big things driving it. One is almost every state at this point surrounding Pennsylvania has legalized recreational marijuana. I believe West Virginia is the only one that hasn't. Ohio just did a few months ago. So one argument here is we're basically surrounded by it. So why not go through with it? The other one, as we see with a lot of proposals related to skill games or other things, is, we need more state revenue coming in. We need more taxation to fill the coffers here. And this presents a big opportunity. There's arguments about, it's safer if we actually legalize this and bring it into the regulatory sphere out in the open. But I think a lot of what underlines this, when we're looking at mental health funding, when we're looking at education, when we're looking at age-old services, healthcare, there's a lot of acknowledgement here that Pennsylvania's long-term trajectory as far as revenue is long-term declining. And so finding any way to actually come in and boost that, or at least stop things from hemorrhaging as we have more demand for funding all across the board. I think that's really compelling. There's of course there's arguments for civil liberties, freedom, criminal justice reform, but on the left and the right, you really see a lot of arguments centering on this is something that we can regulate it, we can tax it, we can make the state's financial position more solid. That's why we need to go through with it.
And if recreational marijuana were legalized in Pennsylvania, there would be a chain reaction of things here because there's safety to be considered and regulation. So the state would have to get involved, maybe more than is realized at first glance.
Yeah, I think that's true with most of these proposals where Shapiro lists some broad Democratic priorities like raising the minimum wage, like legalizing marijuana, increasing education funding. But a lot of the details he is leaving to the state legislature. And like Anthony said, this is something that he's really pitching as a financial priority. I think there's a 20% tax on wholesale marijuana purchases. And that I think is estimated to bring in $250,000 within the next 5 years. And that's not accounting for how quickly the industry grows and any sort of auxiliary business surrounding it. But I think Shapiro really is trying to make an economic argument for most of his Democratic priorities.
Kate, while you have the floor, and you other fellows are free to comment on this, of course, let's talk about mass transit. In this year's budget proposal from Governor Shapiro. And he wants to make a big boost to SEPTA. And for our viewers statewide, that's the Philadelphia Area Transit Agency. And then, so I think, Kate, you're in a position to tell us, first of all, why are some Philadelphians avoiding SEPTA? What's going on there?
I think overall, SEPTA's just been more spotty than usual. I think there's not as much money going to maintenance. There's not as much money going to operators. So it's just less reliable for people in the area. As someone who takes SEPTA occasionally, I can testify that it takes a while for trains to arrive every once in a while.
So reliability can be a problem?
Yes, when trying to make it to press conferences and whatnot.
There you go.
But there was a report recently that essentially said that SEPTA funding is going to run out, especially given there was an influx of funding from ARPA money during COVID. and we're reaching a cliff. So Shapiro proposed, I believe, 283 million or so to go to statewide funding for public transit. I believe over 100 million of that would end up going to SEPTA. I think about 60 million would go to the Pittsburgh Regional Transit, their local public transit. But it's not increasing any taxes of any sort. It's sort of diverting the sales tax that we already have and essentially allocating it to public transit.
Kate, how much support from local governments is SEPTA getting anyway? Can you say?
I don't have a hard number in my head. I believe it's something in the 50 millions. It's like tens of millions. I don't believe it's
Anyway,
hundreds.
there are complaints from SEPTA that their funding is lower than similar cities with big transit systems. That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, exactly. Yes, SEPTA, there's sort of a perennial complaint. The state government doesn't fund SEPTA enough.
So let's widen out the discussion on mass transit and go beyond SEPTA and consider the effects on rural areas and having mass transit. So how does good news about boosting funding apply to other parts of the state? So again, let's widen it out if we can. Anthony and Bruce.
Yeah, I think, when you're looking at some of this, you're seeing more of a push from some rural legislators of at least trying to get a task force together to study rural mass transit and expand that. Simply because, outside of, the Philadelphia area and Pittsburgh, a little bit in State College, these are not exactly robust systems. Even in the cities, a lot of times, these are not necessarily reliable systems. So there's a concern of not leaving the rural areas behind. And I think it's also, politically, if you're considering ways to expand funding, I mean, the majority of this funding comes from the state and federal sources. And local sources, SEPTA gets somewhere in the range of about 10-15%, I believe, somewhere in that ballpark. So a lot of this is not actually local funding. And so if you're coming to the state, you hear a lot of rural Republican legislators resentful of boosting the funding simply because, it's going to these areas. They're not getting anything out of it. So I think, if you're looking for a statewide compromise or a statewide boost in this funding, you have to offer something to the rural areas, something where they actually get a benefit or they can see, the reason behind it. I think you're also seeing a switch from legislators who are much more aware of, trying to figure out how to get long-term funding, long-term tax revenue in place. And one way we see a shift in this is the debate over housing and trying to allow more housing density along transit corridors. So, a lot of areas in the cities and in the suburbs, it's zoned exclusively for single-family detached housing or single-family housing. And so we're seeing more of a push to get, duplexes or, 3 or 4 unit small apartment buildings in these same areas, because the more you actually get people along these transit corridors, the more people will actually use them. You see ridership figures go up, and you also see some tax funding flowing in more. So that's another area that we're seeing statewide, this larger push to find ways to shore up public transit funding.
We're going to talk some more about the governor's budget proposal, but first I want to make sure that each of you has a chance to tell our viewers where they can find your work. Bruce, why don't you start?
Yes, I've worked for the USA Today Network and Gannett in Pennsylvania, and that includes publications such as the Erie Times News, the Bucks County Courier Times, the York Daily Record, and several others. And so I cover state politics for several publications in that network.
Kate, how about you?
You can find us at spotlightpa.org. We're a nonprofit newsroom. We cover statewide issues as well. And yes, I focus on the state government as well. Anthony,
how about you?
Yeah, and I'm covering statewide news for the Center Square Newswire service. So you can find us at thecentersquare.com.
So some more questions about the governor's proposed budget. Now, of course, as you know, as you're acutely aware, the House is Democrat, the Senate is Republican. So how difficult is it to pass legislation in this divided legislature? Who wants to start that?
It's very difficult. I think at the end of this year, we passed, I want to say, 25, 30 bills total. And part of that is because there was a month-long impasse after the first budget negotiation. There was a movement in December where a bunch of criminal justice bills did pass. There was a lot of hope that this next year there'd be more progress. But the Senate Republicans did hold a presser right after Shapiro's budget address, where they were pretty disparaging about his plans and did not have a lot of nice things to say about upcoming negotiations.
How about you, Bruce?
Yeah, it's going to be extremely interesting this year. He's certainly outlined a pretty bold vision for spending and what he wants to do this upcoming year in the legislature and in Harrisburg. And again, because the Republicans do hold the majority in the Senate, that's obviously a huge part of all of this. And he's going to have to work with and through them to get things done. And I know that they've been pretty vocal about their disappointment, as Anthony mentioned earlier, about additional money for the voucher system when you look at Lifeline scholarships and the past scholarships. And there really wasn't a whole lot of mention of that in this budget either. I think Shapiro's words were that it was unfinished business and said that the legislature has to hash it out themselves. And so if last year is any guide, there's not a lot of hope of that actually happening. And so I'm not sure how amenable the Republican Senate will be to some of these proposals that he's outlined here.
Anthony, let me put a little twist on the same question, and that is, what is Governor Shapiro's relationship with the legislature right now?
Yeah, I think, at least with his Democratic colleagues, it's relatively positive. We don't hear many public castigations going either way. So I think that's at least a sign. Republicans, I think, again, just carrying over some bad blood from the last budget session, they're much more skeptical. They're much more critical of the fact that, you look at their reactions and they're calling the spending reckless and, not really a real plan, not considering for the future. I think there's at least a willingness to talk and go back and forth as far as some common ground. I think it's complicated by not only, the partisan divide between legislative Republicans and the governor, but also the House being in such slim Democratic control. That margin is just, absurdly narrow. So that complicates things even more. There's very little. I think it's symbolic that, the House basically suspended holding any sessions due to a leak in the rotunda. Which is a extraordinarily convenient excuse for not meeting and not putting off, or not meeting and hashing out this business.
We have less than a minute left in our show, everybody. So my last question is, what's next for the governor's budget proposal? He's put it out there, so who takes the next step? Try to tell us in about 30 seconds.
The state legislature is going to start holding budget hearings in the next few weeks. So the Appropriations Committee from the House and the Senate will meet with each of the departments within the governor's, purview, state, education, et cetera, and they'll just question each other essentially on why they need the money they say they need.
Our guests have been Anthony Hennen from the Center Square, Bruce Siwy from USA Today Network, and Kate Huangpu from Spotlight PA. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
That is it for Journalists Roundtable this week. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.